Well, good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are. I'm Rob Atkinson. I'm president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and I'm really excited to host this just fantastic event today on the issue of defense innovation and the relationship to commercial innovation and the commercial industrial base. We're really honored to have our keynote speaker is Congressman Adam Smith. He will be joining us in just a moment. What I want to do is first introduce everyone, including the congressman, and then hopefully by then the congressman will be joining us. Would recommend would just mention that if you want to ask questions anytime during the event, if you're watching at ITIF.org, you can use the Q&A form under the video. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can just follow the link in the event description. Our first speaker is going to be Congressman Adam Smith, who represents Washington's 9th District. Congressman Smith is the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, and he, before that, was a chair of the Subcommittee on Air and Land Forces and the Terrorist, Unconventional Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee. He has a long and distinguished background looking at national defense questions and issues. Mike Brown is the director of DoD's Defense Innovation Unit, which used to be DIUX, but now has graduated to a full-fledged unit. DIU is embedded in key innovation ecosystems across the country, and it builds direct relationships with organizations to strengthen our national security innovation base. And it's a relatively new organization designed to do just that, is to tighten the innovation between commercial companies and the Defense Department. Scott Stapp is the CTO of Northrop Grumman, where he leads the company's technology strategy. I'm sure most or all of you know Northrop Grumman is a leading defense contractor. He helps to ensure the company continues to leverage current technology, and he identifies new solutions to bring customers, creating new business opportunities, and strengthening the company's position on existing programs. Matt Turpin is a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, where he specializes in U.S. policy towards China and technology innovation. He's also a senior advisor at Palantir Technologies. And from 2018 to 2019, he served as the National Security Council's director for China. And before entering the White House, he served over 22 years in the Army in a variety of combat units. And finally, General Stephen Wilson is the former vice chair of the staff of the Air Force, where he presided over the Air Force and served as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Requirements Oversight Council and the Deputy Advisory Working Group. He assisted the Chief of Staff with organizing, training, and equipping the 685,000 active duty Guard, Reserve, and civilian forces in the Air Force. So as you can see, we have a fantastic panel. Why don't I segue into my opening presentation, and then the congressman isn't quite here yet, but let me just frame the entire conversation here. So if we could start with the first slide. The key issue, I think, facing the country now, and not just around our defense posture, but really the key issue facing the country is the United States going to continue to be able to lead in advanced technologies? Something we were able to do in the post-war era, but recently we have not been able to do that as much. So if you go to the next slide. So the U.S. used to dominate R&D. This is one simple example, one simple chart. It's a good pictorial to understand where we were. The U.S. government spent more on R&D in the early 1960s than every foreign government and every foreign company. That's why, or that's a big reason why the U.S. had such a, at the time, insurmountable lead in technology. We were investing in this. We had the greatest national innovation system that's ever been created. And we created it during World War II and after World War II, all the way up through Sputnik and NASA. Next slide. That's not the case anymore. We're less than 10% now of R&D is funded by the federal government globally. And that has led to a decline in our ability to be competitive in technology sectors relative to our competitors. Next slide. And as a result, this isn't just simply something where we can think of the defense industrial base as this separate thing that operates on its own and the commercial technology base as also a separate thing. This is from the DoD's Office of Industrial Policy report in 2019. And if you read that report, actually, you should read the 2020 report, which just came out. Very troubling. They go through a whole set of key critical technologies that the armed forces need. Soldier system sectors, military vehicles, space systems, shipbuilding, STEM skills, as we'll talk about. And they identify them all as having challenges. Now, not to say that we're losing in all of them, but each of them has significant challenges that if we don't address, we're going to have problems going forward. Next slide. And I think the way to think about this is that we have a core DIB, or defense industrial base. Or think about a factory that builds bullets or bombs. Think about a factory that builds defense ships or fighter craft. Then we have a secondary defense industrial base where things can be somewhat dual use. And then we have a commercial industrial base, say the commercial semiconductor industry, where advances are critical to not just overall jobs and competitiveness, but they feed into the defense industrial base. And just the last slide before I turn it over to the Congressman, 2 more slides. What's important to understand is that the defense system is an evolving one, and it historically has evolved by adding on emerging general purpose technologies. When we had the steel and an internal combustion engine, we developed the tank. Before that, we had just, cannons, if you will. And each time we've developed these new systems, the Defense Department has been able to incorporate those. And today we're in the same situation again with AI, robotics, new materials, a whole set of emerging technologies that we have to be strong in order for our defense forces to be able to adequately take advantage of those. And last slide. I would argue, and I say this in a new report that just came out, our new article that just came out in the Department of Defense's PRISM journal, we need a new innovation system. We have to put maintaining U.S. advanced technology leadership in both innovation and production. That has to become a central organizing principle in U.S. economic policy. We can't be indifferent to our industrial structure. The old model of potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? Which leading economic official said in the 1990s, we can't, that's just no longer viable. Clearly, the private sector, both in defense and commercial, has to lead. But the government does need to play an active role. And to do that, we need a new and well-funded national technology system. And the good news of all that is there is certainly a bipartisan, I think, consensus on the Hill now. You see the Biden administration also bringing forth a number of important initiatives. So I feel confident that we're now moving in the right direction. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Congressman Smith.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you so much for joining us. I've already introduced you, so you're good to go.
All right. Thanks. Sorry about that little technological challenge.
No worries.
Basically, I had to download a bunch of stuff into going. I apologize for being a little late, but I really appreciate Rob, putting this together and your work on this, because this is really kind of becoming the central focus of the Armed Services Committee, or one of the biggest policy things that we want to try to start making progress on. We are really behind at the Department of Defense in successfully implementing new technologies to help us meet our national security needs. Obviously, we all know how rapidly changing the world is in terms of technological advancements. And for a variety of reasons, the military is not where it needs to be. And this manifests itself in a bunch of different ways. The biggest one right now is we've just, over the course of the last 20 years, built a lot of major platforms that have wound up costing a lot more money than we thought they were going to cost. They've taken longer to implement. And then by the time we've gotten to the end of it, they haven't had the capabilities that we had expected them to have. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think one of the biggest is what Rob was just showing you in those slides. Whereas in the past, there was a pretty strong relationship between the Department of Defense and leading technology innovation companies in America. That connection isn't as strong as it used to be, and we need to reestablish it. And it is crucially important in our competition with China, bottom line. And yeah, a lot of that sort of feeds into the larger military platforms and systems, but a lot of it is the basic technology. It's 5G technology, it's command and control, it's cyber. all of those things, we do not have the advantage that we once had in these areas, and we need to work hard to reestablish it. And a key part of that is rebuilding the relationship between technology and innovation and the Department of Defense. I also think we've got a major cultural challenge at the Pentagon. And there's a series of things that feed into this. And there's also a significant congressional problem. And let me just lay those out, basically. The Pentagon, first of all, is kind of fighting, as they always say, fighting the last war. And that the last really successful war we had was Desert Storm, where our sheer size and might, our number of platforms, overwhelmed our foe. And that was sort of the focus. So that's, we're building all of these, from the F-35 to the new aircraft carrier to the littoral combat ship to the DDG-1000. Once upon a time, there was a thing called Future Combat Systems that the Army was trying to put together. It was all big and massive, and none of it quite worked the way we wanted it to. And culturally, that's the way the Pentagon looks at these issues. And also the speed. We're working on the F-35. The contract was first awarded in 1997. Technology has changed a lot since then. Pentagon is not in a position to buy as quickly as they need to buy. But then also there is the congressional problem, which is, for members of Congress, the defense budget is a very simple thing. How much money can we take out of it and put back into our individual districts? So once you get rolling down the road of an F-35 or an aircraft carrier or one of these other programs, or I've done a lot of work on space launch, you keep funding the program, even if it's a little bit over budget, even if it's not quite delivering what you want, it is definitely delivering dollars to your district. And in a time when rapid change, rapid innovation is crucial, being so tied to incumbent dollars, to simply just keeping the money flowing the way it's been flowing because it's beneficial to your district, is really crippling to implement the type of innovation that we need to implement. The last thing I want to make before I turn it over for questions and comments is when we're looking at industrial base, well, actually a couple points. One, on our committee, we've tried to step up and address this problem in three main ways. Last year, we had a task force, a Future of Defense task force that was led by Seth Moulton and Jim Banks that really looked at legacy systems versus the new systems that we need to really meet today's needs. Now, that report was enormously helpful. Right now, we have another task force being headed up by Alyssa Slotkin and Mike Gallagher that is looking at the industrial base, at answering this very question. What do we need to make sure that we maintain our military edge against our key competitors? We also formed a new subcommittee that is focused directly on AI and technology to really get at this question and try to figure out how we can make this happen. But as we look at industrial base, I want to make sure that we separate this from just a straight Buy America approach. And I don't have anything against trying to make sure we have domestic capability and that we get the economic and other advantages of being able to build things in America. But I think if we're going to get there in a global economy where there are so many places that have core competencies and are better at certain things than others, we need to expand beyond just the United States. We need to have trusted partners. Yes, we would like every key technology and the best key technologies to be made in the US. It's not realistic. So we definitely prefer that if we had to rely on a technology that wasn't primarily made in the US, we'd rather buy it from Europe or Taiwan than we would to have China be the leader in that technology. So we got to figure out how to build partnerships with other trusted partners to help them develop their industrial capacity to match ours and develop an industrial policy that enables us with our partners to build what we need to build and maintain leadership in key technologies. There's a lot of detail here. I could go on at length about that, but I think the Department of Defense is really crucial to getting the technological advantages we need, certainly, obviously, to meet our national security needs, but also just from pure economic domestic capability. We're going to need the best 5G network, not just for national security purposes, but for economic purposes. And I think we need to rebuild and re-strengthen that partnership between the Department of Defense and cutting edge technology and innovation to get back to getting the advantages that we used to take for granted, 30, 40 years ago. But Rob is like spot on all of this. I've read his stuff, and I'm very, very, very pleased that he's doing this work to address these crucial issues. And I thank you for the chance to say a few words. Again, I apologize for stumbling through the technology and being a little bit late.
No problem. Thank you, Congressman Smith. Do you have a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes for questions?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Wonderful. So if our panelists have questions, feel free to jump in. But I had one question, and that is, you rightly stated that the defense industrial base is not just this narrow thing. It's broader than that. And I guess my question is, how much do you think other members on the committee, both in the House and the Senate, have embraced that kind of broader and maybe newer view?
I think there's a major challenge coming to that. I think some members have, certainly they understand it. And then there are members who, I guess the upside of always wanting to bring money home to your district, they understand the Department of Defense is bringing money home to their district. But there is a rising sort of, anti-DOD sentiment, particularly on the left, it's legitimate to a certain degree. They see the Iraq war as, exhibit A, but others is like, we have relied on the military too much in trying to implement our foreign policy. That's the basic premise, number one. Second premise is every dollar we spend at DOD, we can't spend on education. We can't spend on healthcare. And that's not exactly true when you look at our debt. But those two reasons have really pushed a lot of people to say, let's just cut Department of Defense. We don't believe in what they're doing. And so they're not focused on this question. They're just focused on the fact that DOD represents excessive U.S. militarism. Cut it. And I think that is starting, the tension is growing there. So I believe that we need to rebuild a bipartisan consensus towards the idea of DOD of being a key innovator. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest places we can do this that should bridge that gap is on climate change. I mean, DOD is investing a ton. I see Michael Brown's on here. He knows this stuff really well. Is investing a ton of money in, new battery technology for one thing, storage capacity, all of that. So I think there is room to sort of build a new bipartisan consensus on this issue to fight back against some of the anti-defense stuff that's going on.
Great. I want to turn over to Mike. Just a quick comment on that, Congressman. Dorothy Robine, who was Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Installations, recently wrote a report for us on what DOD is doing in terms of climate and just how it's a significant amount they're doing, both in terms of what they're doing here in the bases as well as things like batteries and other things. So couldn't agree with you more on that. Mike.
Yes, thanks, Rob, and Chairman Smith. Thanks for being with us here today, and thanks for all of what you're doing through the committee structure to help the Department of Defense modernize. I think both you and Rob have talked about the need to really engage a broader segment of the industrial base, or what the defense strategy calls the innovation base, to make that happen. And I think one of the criticisms that could be made of Defense Innovation Unit and other groups like us is we're kind of operating on the fringe as opposed to in the mainstream of DoD procurement. Just wondering what your thoughts are about what should happen to really increase that engagement. And part of it is awareness that we want more of the industrial or innovation base to know the needs of the Department of Defense. And then part of it is we have to get more serious about the flow of dollars to some of the other suppliers there. Thoughts that you have on how we should do that, how we should think about that?
Absolutely. Seth Moulton and I were just talking about this before I got on this call, as a matter of fact. And I think it is fundamentally changing the way the Pentagon does business. I mean, the Pentagon is built around the idea of spending a massive amount of money on very, very large platforms. And they are not that much focused on innovation and technology. And I guess the analogy that occurs to me, and some may not like this analogy, but I chaired the terrorism subcommittee back in 2007, 2008, as SOCOM was emerging as the counterterrorism force. And there's a long history of how the Special Operations Command was developed. But for the longest time, it was secondary, okay? It was, it was a small piece. It was exactly what you are right now. It was a small piece that would be used occasionally, but the big Army, the big Air Force, those were the guys who were calling the shots, running the show, and determined where the money was spent. Well, after 9/11, it was determined that, as Stanley McChrystal said, it takes a network to beat a network. How do you build a network to get out there after Al Qaeda? And special operations was the best trained to do this, because we weren't going to be fighting Al Qaeda with 1,000 tanks on a battlefield. Okay, it was going to be counterterrorism, counterinsurgency. SOCOM was perfectly built for that, and we grew it. And I know there's criticism of how that came out and everything, but by and large, we now use the Special Operation Command in like 75 to 90 different countries to keep terrorism under control. And you can debate how well it worked or it didn't, but knock on wood, we haven't had another 9/11 style attack, and we've managed to keep them on the run because we innovated that way. And now, as you know, SOCOM is a much bigger entity, plays a much bigger role. That's what we need to do on technology. Get to the point where the procurement people over at the Pentagon, this is the 24/7 focus. How do we buy better software? And just one final example on this, I've made some comments about the F-35 here recently, born a lot of frustration, but also just the reality of how bad that program is. Huge part of it is software. We don't know how to buy software, and the whole freaking plane is dependent upon software. Okay, so it's got great missiles, all that stuff, but the software keep breaking down, and they got to redo it. It's because we don't know how to do it. We need a SOCOM for buying technology, if you will. And you see now at the Pentagon, people are getting this. It's cliche, but it's like turning an oil tanker around. It takes some time, but look at what Chief of Staff Brown and Berger, Marine Corps and Air Force. They get this, and they are really focused on how to fix this. But it's a big building, a lot of history. We got to start moving to get to the point where DIU and other organizations are as big as SOCOM, bottom line, in terms of really driving how the Pentagon does business.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Well, let me ask one, and then we'll wrap it up. And that is, oftentimes DoD is given a mission because it's where the money is. So, for example, we proposed an initiative a few years ago that Senator Coons picked up on, and that was the idea of creating a network of about 10 manufacturing universities. So these would be universities that really focused on outreach, engineering co-op programs for their students, partnerships with industry. And the program was given to DoD because that's where the money was. And frankly, in my opinion, it wasn't what the vision was originally. It was sort of tailored to a more narrow DoD view. And I guess, we see now Senator Schumer in the Senate, and there's a similar bill in the House around the Endless Frontier Act. There seems to be kind of a little bit more appetite for, quote, industrial policy or technology policy. Do you see that coming along? How do you see that coming along? And do you think it's complementary to what the DoD is going to need?
Absolutely. This is not just DoD, as you said. There's governments investing in a lot of different places. The industrial base has a lot of different needs. Heck, the infrastructure package that we're all talking about. There's one piece of the infrastructure package that only occasionally gets written about, and that is, let's say that we pass $2 trillion. Who's going to build the roads and the bridges and all this? What's the workforce development plan that's going to go along with that, seeing as how a lot of those jobs can't be filled right now? So, if you sort of analogize that over to what we're talking about here, there's huge domestic needs here that are only tangentially related to DoD. And I think it'd be great if, we could build that partnership. But I still like the Department of Defense as a driver of innovation and technology, because of what you said. It's where the money is, but also it's where the capability is. This was something during the COVID, in the early days last March, when a whole bunch of people, and I was just one of them, were trying to get the Trump administration to, forgive me, give a damn, and try to make this work. And I wanted DoD to be more involved because, when you look at, testing, getting the PPE out, all this, it was a massive logistical challenge. And I forget the statistics. Secretary Esper told me what the statistics were. And you looked at, You look at what HHS and FEMA did in terms of procurement in a given year, and then you looked at what DOD did in terms of procurement in a given year, they were better at it. They had the experience, they had the logistics, they knew how to do it. So let's use them, let's take advantage of that talent and understanding. But yeah, it's gotta fold in a whole bunch of other pieces to really have an effective industrial policy to meet the challenges that we face.
Yeah, and the other piece that people always talk about, at least in the tech policy world, DoD is a buyer, and that you get that last component there, which is critical to innovation, as opposed to just doing something and letting it sit on the side. I think we just have one last question from the audience, and that's so what do you think, Congressman, about what the Chinese officials said recently, that the U.S. is, quote, no longer occupying the position of strength, presumably vis-a-vis China in global affairs?
I'm going to try to keep this short because this is actually a core principle that I have here. Look, I mean, China is a growing power, and we're the one on top. Okay, I mean, I'm sorry, I watched the whole Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls thing back there. It's like Detroit beat Boston. Boston had been the power, and they finally knocked them off, and then Chicago beat Detroit, and it's not always that seamless in sports. But at any rate, we're the biggest, most powerful country militarily and economically. China wants a seat on the stage. And so part of what they're trying to do is to tear us down. Okay. They want other people to think that, no, they're better than us. And that's just going to be part of it. Now, the part that is really important to me that I don't think gets talked about often enough is we look at this and we go, oh my goodness, China's coming. We must remain dominant. This was the new American century nonsense that the neoconservatives cranked out in the mid-90s, that the single most important thing in foreign policy is the United States of America has to be without peer, basically. We have to dominate. That's absurd, okay? It's absurd primarily because it's impossible to achieve. And I think, and this is one of my great big sociological theories from my 30 years in public life, we are totally spoiled by the post-World War II world, okay? That was an anomaly, all right? Great, we won the war, and better yet, we won it on the road. So everyone else got destroyed and we didn't. So yeah, we had a good run there, but that's not the way the world normally works, okay? There's going to be peer competitors, and we're going to spin ourselves into the ground if we try to imagine that China can't ever become a peer with us. We are going to compete with them, and they're going to rise, and I think we're still going to be a power. Now, where I'd push back on China is, we're still a pretty big player here. Okay, we're still winning a fair number of championships ourselves. All right, and yeah, good for you. I'm glad that you're no longer, I think it was like sports analogies are my thing. The Oregon Ducks and UW. For like 25 years, Oregon was a freaking joke. All right. And we just stomped them all over the place. And then for 10 years, they did that to us. And now it's a little bit more back and forth. And that's just sort of the way the world works. So my pushback on China is we're going to be a player. We're going to be out there and we're going to compete with them on a whole bunch of things. But right now, I am really worried that so much of our policy is, oh my God, China. No, they're coming for us. We're not going to dominate anymore. It's like, it's okay. All right. Being the dominant power in the world actually has a pretty big downside. And that downside is everyone expects you to fix every freaking problem in the world. And we're not going to, and we can't. But that expectation is still out there. I will never forget being in a refugee camp in Jordan with a bunch of Syrian refugees, 5-6 years ago, something like that. And they were pissed when I showed up. It was like, you guys have decided to let Assad do this. Why are you letting him do this? Why, we are dying in the streets, we are starving, and you're not fixing it because you don't want to. And I was like, yeah, that's not it. We can't. But they didn't believe that. You're the United States of America. Whatever you want, it happens magically. That's a level of pressure that we don't need. So if China wants to come on the stage and we want to go ahead and be peer competitors, there's a way to make that work. That's all I'm saying. It's not easy. It's not simple. We're talking about one of the areas where it's very difficult here. But what we need to do is try to make that work. Try to make that world work. Instead of talking about, and I go on all these briefings, oh my God, China's building the J-20, China's building a submarine. Therefore, we have to build 5,000 submarines. We have to figure out how to compete. Okay. Yeah, be ahead of them in some places, not going to be ahead of them everywhere, and maintain our core objectives. And I won't get into those because I've already gone on too long, but maintain the core of what we want to achieve, not imagine a world where we can somehow cow China. We're going to compete, and that's okay. But let's figure out how to do it and do it intelligently. And this area is an area where we got to get a lot better. This isn't a matter of, okay, domination is impossible, so we're doing the best we can. We are not doing the best we can right now in terms of developing new technologies and in developing an industrial policy in this country. So we need to work to get to a better place on that.
Great. Well, thank you, Congressman. That actually is one of the nice things about this is it's a win-win, if you will. If we do that, we'll have better jobs in more parts of the country. We'll have better competitiveness, and we'll have a stronger military technology base. So that's something that I think everybody supports. By the way, I would just mention, being a Duck, the Ducks are ahead in the tournament today. I saw that. Congratulations.
I forgot about that, Rob. Sorry.
No worries. All right, Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, your time and your leadership, and we wish you all the best this year as you deal with these issues in the committee.
Well, likewise. Thank you. Appreciate your leadership as well. Thank you.
Okay. All. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Well, that was great. Let me jump right in now to our discussion with our panelists, and that actually is a good segue that the Congressman alluded to on China. So let's start with China, because obviously it's the elephant in the room, if you will. What's the China challenge that we should be worrying about? Well, they have civil military fusion, which seems different than our system. How should we be thinking about China? I don't know. Matt, do you want to lead that? Start off with that, because that was your focus for a couple of years in the White House.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think what the Congressman laid out was, I think right on. The idea that the PRC is not 10 feet tall. It does have a set of policies around using the power of the state to achieve outcomes. They have certainly identified areas in which they want to be able to have not only sort of peer capability, but superior capability. But many of those things are very hard to achieve. And the PRC has certainly been trying in a number of areas. Certainly we've seen it in aircraft engine manufacturing or within semiconductors, or in a number of different areas that the PRC has tried to make progress.
Matt, you're frozen. I don't know if that's, I think that's probably on your end.
Am I back now?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, try it now. No, you want to, I don't know, Matt, you want to try it without the video when you're talking? See what that's like? Sorry about that. You're still frozen.
How about now? Can you hear me?
That's better. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So all I would say is certainly the Beijing can lay out plans, but it's still difficult to determine whether or not those things can actually be achieved. I think as we think about our ways forward in terms of how do we innovate as a country, and what does this mean for our own defense industrial base, I think we've got to think very clearly sort of about our own challenges and what we want to achieve, rather than a complete and total fixation on what Beijing is trying to achieve. We certainly need to be mindful of it, but that isn't what should be the full focus of our actions.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
Yeah, of course, I find myself always agreeing with Matt Turpin. I think this is a very difficult challenge because it is so multidimensional. Basically, the China challenge is geopolitical, it's ideological, it's military, but most importantly, it's economic. And I think that China's focus is on how to use technology to transform their economy, so that they can still be growing, do things for their population. And so I think the most important dimension for us to focus on is the tech race, because that's what China sees as important underpinning the transformation of their economy. And I think they're right with that, meaning we essentially benefited from all of the investment and technology development during the space race when we were rivaling the Soviets, because that had untold spillover effects to the US economy as internet, GPS, you name it, came out of that, miniaturized electronics, that built tremendous economic prosperity and made sure that we were leading technology for decades. That is now, the investment we're making in the US is in decline in terms of R&D, as you showed in your opening comments, and we don't have the same national purpose that we had historically or that China has now. So I think the key for us is to think about, if this is a tech race, if it's multi-generational, which I believe it's going to be, is not something we're going to decide in one administration. We need to think about what are the policies. You alluded to industrial policy. We need to think about sectors that are important, as you pointed out, and I couldn't agree with you more. Potato chips are not the same as computer chips. Economists don't make that distinction by sector, but the sectors are critical. The technology sectors are the one that's going to ensure that we have the economic prosperity for decades to come. And that's going to in turn lead to better national security. We're going to feel more secure. So I think key for us is focusing on the tech race. What are the policies that make sure that we're in the forefront with allies in these key game-changing technologies of the future? And that's going to lead to good things, just as it has for us historically.
Thanks, Mike. General Wilson.
Yeah, let me jump in because, I agree with Mike Brown completely. We've talked a lot about this. And if you look at, let's examine the China problem a little bit. As Mike said, they've picked their areas to focus on. They call them mega projects, and whether it be in AI or space or hypersonics or quantum, they're focused there, and they're focused as a whole of nation. So it isn't just their industry or their academia, their national labs or their military. They're all in to focus and to be dominant in that area. So the question I'd ask before is, I say, what are our mega projects? Or maybe what should our mega projects be that we should focus on and get behind as a whole of nation? And again, we know how to compete with anybody, but we have to understand what the competition looks like. As Mike said, then develop the policies to allow us to be able to do that.
So let me just move. That's a good segue into, all right, I think both the congressman and you have all said really what we need to be focusing on is us. Using the Michael Jordan analogy, if anybody saw that great 8-part series, it was fantastic. Michael Jordan focused on himself and his teammates and how to get better. And so we need to focus on that. What do you see as the challenges to the defense technology system today? I know, Mike, you've talked about that, or somebody I know talked about a number of the technologies that the DoD has targeted are pure dual use technologies. And so they're not just, again, narrow DIB technologies. What are some thoughts on that?
I'll start. Well, we clearly need defense-oriented technologies. So what Scott's doing, what Northrop Grumman's doing, the key parts of our defense industrial base, we need them to be stronger than ever. But we've also got to broaden our focus to include more of the dual use or commercial technologies. So 8 out of the 10 Defense Department modernization priorities are commercial or dual use. And the question is, for technologies that we're not leading. So if we look beyond what we're doing in hypersonics, directed energy, or other defense-oriented technologies, what is our system at DoD for making sure that we're adopting those, and our tremendous buying power can be used to actually make sure that the U.S. continues to lead in these areas. So I think DoD has to learn a different motion for these commercial technologies, which is how to be the fast follower. So we know how to develop technology and bring that into the department. The defense industrial base has done a better job probably than any economy in the world in doing that. But for this new era where we're not leading, the U.S. isn't leading, and the Defense Department isn't leading, what is the motion that we need? And I think, as Congressman Smith just talked about, we don't seem to have that down. We're not moving fast enough, and it's not broad enough. And these are the technologies, AI, autonomous systems, cyber, they're going to be moving at a much faster pace than traditional defense technology. So this is where we can get behind in a hurry. Because of the greater investment that's happening in these commercial technologies, led by consumers, not by militaries, and because of the faster pace at which they come out, this is where, if we're not paying attention and creating that new motion, I have big concerns that we can get behind in a hurry, and that will be a difficult ground to make up.
Scott.
So I actually agree completely that we do have to find a way to really compete more on the commercial side of the house. The real issue is when you look at China, and it's already been discussed, is they really look at everything as a whole of government approach. So their separation between their commercial and their defense is not really that significant. So when you look at the U.S., the difference between commercial and defense, everything in defense is at a classified level, right? So it's hard to do it. When we do commercial, we really make it open commercial. Everybody has access to it. We see China already exploiting, not just in the unclassified realms, but others, all the technology we develop. If you look at China, it's not that easy to go in and even steal the technologies they have, even on a commercial level, because they keep it at a more of a whole of government approach. So when you start looking at us on a defense side, what you really start thinking about is, okay, the Department of Defense, again, 30 years Air Force, we hire warfighters in the Department of Defense. We don't typically hire technologists. So that transition of pulling commercial technologies into the Department of Defense, we don't have a lot of folks that we intentionally hire just to look at future warfighting of future technologies. And I think a lot of that is culturally, we're going to have to think about how we view ourselves as a service, because services are organized, train, and equip, and how we think about that and prepare capabilities for the warfighter, which is the COCOM, and actually start bringing folks in. So AIML was a good one. So I think everybody would agree that Google has done amazing things in AIML. I think Silicon Valley and the US is a leader in AIML, but AIML is very mission specific. There is no general artificial intelligence. It is very task specific. Well, for the Department of Defense, you have to be a mission expert. You have to understand. So you need this blend of warfighter and technologist to understand how you can apply AIML tools over the top of any specific mission. So you need them blended closer together. So some of this is how we recruit and retain folks within the department that is a combination of technologist and warfighter, if that makes sense.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Matt.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, we've focused here on sort of what the Department of Defense needs to do and be able to be prepared for. But I think it's also significant to add that there's a broader backdrop of what this competition looks like. What the Chairman Smith was laying out in his description really reflects sort of a broader understanding from a U.S. position that our fundamental relationship with the PRC has changed. One of where we thought for years that we would use economic engagement and focused economic development to liberalize the PRC and therefore sort of make them into a sort of responsible stakeholder, and then we now see them as a competitor. And that while the Department of Defense for decades has been focused on hedging against the possible sort of downside risks of the PRC and various other powers, the rest of our government has not been focused on that, right? And I think what's incredibly important, particularly as the Biden administration comes in and talks about broader competition, is what the rest of the U.S. government and the rest of sort of U.S. industry does with this reality, right? As Rob, as you laid out at the beginning, that the Department of Defense sort of continues to now have this sort of small fraction, right? If we're going to move the broader sort of things that go on in this competition, it's going to require more than the Department of Defense to be able to take these actions. And so I think, to me, that's one of the most key and important things that's going on. We aren't going to be able to use this exact same playbook we've used in the past.
General Wilson.
Yeah, I completely agree with Matt. This is why, it's as I've been going around talking to people, I think this sense of urgency across all Americans to understand what the competition is. It's not just a defense problem, it's all of us. And we've got to stop thinking like we're the big alliance. Chairman Smith kind of mentioned that. And now start thinking more like we're David. right? That we've got to be hungrier and be able to compete in areas that are important to our nation. And again, whether it be on values, on technology, but understanding the competition is really important in this case. And it's going to be all of us, not just the military needs to be doing this.
Yeah, I think one way to think about that is the old we're Avis and we try harder. Remember that? We're number 2 and we try harder. Well, we've been Hertz for so long, we stopped trying as hard as we should. And now we got to recognize that, wait a minute, that Chinese Avis might overtake us. So we better work harder and smarter. I want to
real quick.
Yeah.
Sorry. And I'm good because I totally agree with Matt. I mean, what's interesting with China is, would we have the same feeling about China if they were not an expansionist type nation? If we didn't have disputed territories, other things. If they were locked down to where they were and they weren't looking at expansionism, would we have the same feeling about China? And so I think it really is about, because there are other nations that cause, I think, the U.S. and the DoD problems, but if they're not expansionist, we don't tend to think of that. We lock it down in a certain way, and we think of it more of you don't have to fight that long game because you're not going to look at trying to defend territories that are far from your area. You really can play a home game, and that's what China's doing. Is their advantage is they get to play a home game. Being an expeditionary force or force projection is really hard to do across the entire world. You have to essentially dominate the world to do that. Not all at once, but in pieces, and that's a hard game.
Yeah, and that's, Scott, that raises another issue which we haven't touched on, and that's the dependency on China on some of the core things that we need for certainly our commercial industrial base, but even our defense industrial base. I was talking to somebody in government recently who said that there are certain core, I won't say which component is, but certain core components that are made in China that the DoD needs. And I think at some point we have to realize that just cannot be sustainable. That it's not, obviously we're not in favor of decoupling and we're going to be an integrated economy, but there's certain things that we have to be able to have capability of domestically. I'm just curious people's thoughts on that question.
Yeah, to me, it's sort of a no-brainer. If your assumption, if your broader policy assumption is that there is very little chance in which your competitor is going to turn into a geopolitical competitor, and that ultimately all you're doing is sort of competing in a commercial way, then you can allow those kinds of vulnerabilities to sort of take place. But as you begin to understand that you've got significant vulnerabilities to a geostrategic competitor, and that competitor is using coercion to achieve its ends at the expense of your own interests and to endanger your allies, it is quite logical that you would continue to find ways to reduce those vulnerabilities. Now, that doesn't mean you go to zero in terms of trade, right? And so I think, all too often we've sort of framed this discussion around decoupling in sort of a binary, right? We are either coupled or decoupled. And the reality is we were never as coupled as we had sort of assumed, right? We've maintained a comprehensive arms embargo against the PRC since 1989, along with our European friends and plenty of others around the world. So we've always had a degree of decoupledness in that relationship. And so I think it's important to understand that this is a perception change, and we are realizing that there are things that we probably have to fix that we didn't have, that we had assumed would not be that big of a deal in the past.
If I can jump in, I think this is a relatively new problem for us because the Soviets never presented this. Closed economy, they didn't make anything that anyone wanted to buy, with the exception of Stolichnaya. And so we didn't have this. Now, China's taken a completely different approach and done a tremendous job of integrating themselves in the world, the largest trading partner with dozens of countries. So now all of our economics, as we've practiced them for the last 50 years, have been based on the shareholder revolution and free markets do best, don't interfere. And you have to change some of that thinking if you're facing a major geostrategic competitor, as Matt talked about. And so that means certain components, products, whether it's semiconductors or pharmaceuticals, we're not going to be comfortable relying on China. So we have to think about some guardrails for the market-based economy, which we love. Most often that will work, but for certain components, it's not going to. And we can't be as reliant as we are on today for a number of key components to the military. You pointed out several of them in that summary of the report that Industrial Policy has produced, the DoD report. But one of the ones that's certainly on my mind is semiconductors. DoD only buys 2 to 3% of the world's semiconductors, but it's absolutely critical. And if we were to face some sort of disturbance in the supply chain for semiconductors, it would effectively shut the U.S. economy down. We can't afford to be in that position.
Yeah, Mike, you say that, by the way, as a former CEO of a major technology company, Symantec. So there is that balance we need to find of markets and business, but also national interest. So Scott, were you going to jump in?
No, I actually, I just want to kind of reiterate what Michael and Matt both said, which is what's interesting is we are all based on this free and open economy, right? Basically free trade. But the problem is that's what's got you into this situation, right? Is you go where the market takes you. Whereas if you look at China, it is massively subsidized on the semiconductor side of the house. The government is massively subsidizing it. So if you say that word in the U.S., it's a dirty word. You can't say subsidize with a company, but they're using a different economic kind of formula to actually cause us problems on the defense side that we're going to have to rethink as a nation. Because if you really want to, if it is a really critical item, which I believe it is, semiconductors and microelectronics, and you want to have it in the U.S., it is not going to be a free standalone capability that is not going to take government subsidies. Yeah, and that right now it's just the way, as you heard the congressman, I mean, the way they're thinking is that is not the way they want to think about it.
Absolutely. So that's a good way to segue in the next question, which is, by the way, we could spend a day on this next question, but the challenges within DoD. General Wilson, you when we were talking earlier, you mentioned this, I think, a really important but obvious point, which is the Air Force has been, well, before the Air Force, it was in the Army, but the military has been flying planes since the First World War, and they fire things and kill people. But the planes today are massive software systems, and they upgrade with software. And how do you see DoD being able to take advantage of effectively of this sort of, if you will, fourth industrial revolution, or this IT wave, whatever you want to call it? That does seem to be the critical thing, to be able to integrate all of these systems, whether it's AI or IoT, into our weapons systems and platforms. How's that going, and what do we need to do?
Yeah, so Rob, as you and I talked previously, we are going through this transformation. I think all the services to become a digital force, right? And with that, I mean, I need the digital skills, and part of that is certainly software. We joke that the F-35 looks like an airplane, but it's a giant supercomputer that flies. And yet everything that we're relying on these days is relying on software. So we're going from a hardware company to a software company. And to do that, we've got to skill the people to be able to do that in this digital transformation. And I think all the services are going through the same problem. And again, as the conversation went out earlier, the area we haven't really talked about is the people part, right? Because I got to upskill the people with the education, training, and experience they need, and then to be able to get them into our service to be able to do that. And that's where we face a challenge. Candidly today, the U.S. is being out competed. China's doing 8x or 10x the number of STEM graduates as we are today. That's a big problem. When you roll that over a decade of time, that makes a major problem. We've got to think our way through that. But all the services are going through this, and again, transforming from hardware companies to software companies.
Yeah, I want to come back to the skills part, because the challenge that companies like Northrop have is you really have to hire Americans for these skills. Some of the big tech companies, they can hire people on visas, and then there are just a lot of foreign people who have these skills and they want to come to the U.S., and that's great for us, but it makes some challenges there. Related to this software issue of sort of becoming a software organization rather than just a hardware organization, I mean, really software and hardware, clearly. There's another question which the congressman alluded to, and that's speed, scale up. How do you integrate more with the private sector? How do you get faster? How do you get more nimble? Thoughts on that? How do we do that?
Well, I'll give you a quick thought. I call it the 10 Moore's Law problem. And as we start with the requirements piece on one side that takes way too long, and we go through everything from a capability-based assessment to analysis of alternatives to capability development documents before we even make a decision on what we're going to buy. And then we go through a procurement process and then a testing process. And so as the congressman said, things take way too long, and they're in many cases obsolete before fielded. So I got to take that linear process and move it this way. And so that we're doing those concurrently, and we're doing those with speed. And then again, the other key part is when things don't work, as the constituent side as you talked about challenges with Congress, is I got to be able to divest, right? To accelerate and build the capability we need, I got to be able to divest the things that we don't need and free up the resources to be able to do that. So again, we have to compress that time. We've got to be able to take things that are no longer going to be viable in future conflict, get rid of them, and replace them again with, that's why Dr. Roper in the previous administration, when he was the AQ, said we're going to get into the Century Series fighter design. And what he really meant was, I'm going to try and produce a new airplane every 5 years. So there's always something in design and production, and we'll just get into a rhythm of doing that versus keeping something and maintaining it for 50 years, and quite frankly, all the costs associated with that. And then again, technologically, it's not up to speed to what we need where the technology's moving.
Hey, Scott, I'm just curious your thoughts on that, being obviously with one of the leading defense contractors. And, there are a whole set of technologies, both on the software side and the tooling side, that are making, if you will, flexible production easier, faster. How do you see that at Northrop in terms of playing a role in that ability of DoD to be more fast, nimble, dynamic, innovative?
So I think, and I think General Wilson hit on a lot of it, which is like probably everybody else, we're going to be a digital company in just a handful of years. Our goal is to make it, because that will actually help you speed with internals to the company on how you build stuff. I will tell you, you hit on it too on the university side. When we go look at recruiting at some of these advanced degrees, you have some of the high-end schools that have 70% of their grad students non-U.S. citizens. It's a tough group to pull from. And then on the U.S. citizen side, you're still competing with the commercial side. So defense industry is struggling with pulling some of the best and brightest. With General Wilson, so since he was on the JROC, I actually ran the JROC for 2 years. I will tell you, I think a lot of this is a requirements problem. I think we coined the term desirements versus requirements, is that if you always want the absolute 100% high end, you're going to find yourself in a path where it takes a long time and a lot of money to get there. If you can settle on a 85% solution, then you will probably get there faster and with less money. Now, what I will tell you is you assume risk with that. And this is an interesting thing when you talk about China too versus somebody like the US. They have no problems employing blood and treasure at it. We just typically want to throw treasure at the problem. And when we start talking about risk and death and everything else, the US is very averse at putting people knowingly in harm's way. And other nations are not so averse at doing that. That will always cause us a problem of requiring us to be technologically much superior than our adversaries. Well, as they close that technology gap from here to here, but the human capital gap is still here, we're going to have to think about how we want to attack that. Basically, we can develop, I think, very capable weapon systems that we can be significantly faster, significantly less costly, but there will be 100% of folks won't always come home. And that's something the U.S. as a whole is going to have to struggle with when they go into a war fight.
Yeah, no, it seems like a critical question. It's sort of somewhat the same question, frankly, with a simpler thing of autonomous vehicles. You want 100% or do you want 99.9%? 99.9% is a heck of a lot better than what we have today, which is a lot of dumb and drunk humans getting in accidents. Mike, yeah.
Rob, I'll jump right before Mike. Give you an example of what Scott said. On the requirements side, I was working with a great young group of smart folks, and they designed some capabilities. Said, hey, we don't want to build it at 99% reliability. We think we can do it for 83%. And if we do that, it'll drop the cost factor down by 20x. And it's like, okay, well, and so we would say, is it good enough at 1/20 the cost to be, and it's like, yeah, we need to be looking at those trades all the time. But to Scott's part, the requirements problem piece is a big part of this. We've got to turn that on its head.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mike?
I just want to add the cost side of this is a key part that China is looking at as they think about asymmetric capabilities to address our superior, exquisite systems that we build. So they're thinking about, what can I do with an anti-ship ballistic missile that includes AI to defeat an aircraft carrier? That's their mindset. So I think to Scott's point and General Wilson's point, that's exactly what we need to do. And on the speed side, I think the commercial world has already shown us what we need to do. The Defense Department is used to being the only customer and biggest customer, but we have to refine the new motion. We need to be a fast follower is we've got to work on commercial terms. So rather than us having the luxury of doing our own terms, setting the requirements, we decide everything. How do we, as a fast follower, work with commercial terms and speed? Don't require special IP. That's going to allow us to iterate. And the key in the commercial world to achieve speed is iteration, not thinking we can plan 5 years for requirements, then build something for 50 years. The commercial world is all about the cycle time that gets reduced to iterate. And that's the way I think we can achieve that. If we start to think about our major programs is how do we do something that's iterative? We're only going to have something in production for a few number of years and then iterate to the next version. We'll get a lot of that speed that we're looking for.
Great. So I want to delve into one more sort of broader topic and then leave some time for folks with questions, which there are a lot of. And that's, we had Congressman Smith on the panel. There may be staffers watching. What are a few things? Clearly, DoD needs to make some institutional changes here, be more nimble, et cetera. What are the things Congress needs to do specifically? What are one or two on the top of your wish list? Let me start with General Wilson. I mean, related to budgets or whatever. What are your thoughts there?
Rob, certainly, as we would testify each year, most of the vices would say we need stable, predictable, adequate budgets. Let's just take this year as another data point. We think that the new administration is looking over what will change from previous. The budget will be submitted in May. There's very high likelihood that there'll be a CR, and the CR will go through probably January. And that's probably what we've seen 9 out of the last 10 years, right? And it's hard to do programs when you don't know what your budget's going to be, and the budget continually changes. So a stable, predictable, adequate budget would be first and foremost. Second, I'd say is flexibility in how you spend that money. That there, what pot of money, the different, where does software fit in this piece, and how do I spend for software? And it changes all the time. And so the number of line items and how we have to pigeonhole the money would be another area that I think is ripe for Congress to be able to roll up their sleeves and be able to fix and help the department become better.
Yeah, that implies sort of trust on both sides, if you will, and more openness. Mike.
Yeah, General Wilson really hit this. We do need the stability, but more flexibility. Senior leaders like General Wilson need the ability to match what do we have to spend versus what the current needs are. And as probably everyone listening knows, it takes the Department of Defense 2 years to program $1 of spending. That's within the product life cycle of some of the technologies we're trying to bring at the Defense Innovation Unit. So that really doesn't work anymore in a competition with China that doesn't have these constraints of being a democracy, and it doesn't work to get the latest technology to warfighters. So we have to rethink that, and that doesn't mean the whole defense budget needs to be flexible and changing, but a certain portion of it, senior leadership like General Wilson, they need the ability to make those decisions in real time. And right now, you can't do that with a budget that has thousands of line items that tell General Wilson exactly what he needs to spend 2 years in advance.
Well, in the old days, we had skunk works. And it seems like there was more flexibility back in the 50s and 60s where defense contractors could do really interesting and creative and out-of-the-box things. And it seems like over time, we've narrowed that box to be a pretty small box. Scott?
So what I'll tell you, and you just hit it on skunkworks. So I got to run the Black World budget for the Air Force for a couple, 3 years. And what you find out is it's one big, large budget item. And you can move money around within that budget to a bunch of different activities. So that where normally in a white world program, you'd budget to like 80% confidence. The answer is you're going to spend it at 80% because if you're underspending, your money gets taken away. So you're going to spend whatever you have to, even if it's 80%. If you fund everything in the black world, we did it at 50%. Things that go under and things that go over tended to balance, so you could actually make your money management work out. And the Hill was really interesting, was really happy with it. And they would ask us, how are you doing that versus the white world? And the answer is because you give us flexibility that you don't give the white world. You monitor every individual PE, where in the black world, for security reasons, we blend them all into one gigantic one. And so that level of flexibility, like Michael's talking about and General Wilson, is actually really critical to allowing the flexibility to meet what the really rapid demands are.
Great. Matt, you also have been you've been a soldier here and also in the White House. Any thoughts on that, where, Congress invited you up to testify? What would you tell them?
Well, I would also, just sort of bring it back to our sort of main competitor. They have plenty of their own internal frictions of these things as well, right? So, we have some benefits of transparency and the ability to sort of have overwatch and be able to sort of see if things are working well. And I think, there are obviously, some bad aspects of keeping things concealed and not having good amount of transparency to be able to see what works and what doesn't work, right? Which then leads to sort of institutions and entities really being able to grab money that isn't necessarily well spent, right? So, we may lay out for the PRC that they have this ability to be able to sort of quickly innovate and bring money to bear and make things work. Where, I also, have to raise an awful lot of questions about how effective they are at that. I think from a my experience, in the White House and in the Pentagon, I think it's, and I think we are moving down this path. We had to sort of make from a broader government perspective about what our policy approach was going to be from a broad perspective. And now that we sort of landed on a concept of competition, you can now institute that policy across departments and agencies and have a degree of coherence in what you're doing. And I think, much of where the Department of Defense found themselves struggling as they were coming to grips with what they saw was a growing competition with the PRC was that they were sort of working at cross purposes with other departments and agencies who had a different policy approach, right? And I think we're actually in a much better position now. And so, I think we if we look at how that would then unfold, over the budget cycles coming in the follow-on years, that likely means that we'll some of these things will ease up a little bit, and we may find ourselves in a better position than what we thought we were before.
Yeah, I mean, just one related point to that, Matt. I feel like somehow in this country we have this view that if we sort of coordinate and think strategically that we're committing some kind of sin, it's just better to sort of let's do whatever the heck we want. And while I agree with you 100%, we've made progress there, I still feel like we're missing kind of the key thing, which is how do we understand what DoD technology needs are broadly in the broad, commercial base? How do we then align what other agencies are doing and what kinds of new things we need, whether it's through NIST or NSF or other agencies? How do we begin to get alignment there? And I don't even feel we're doing the first step on that. I'd just be curious if people disagree with me on that.
I mean, I think one of the the department, it's I would say its primary mission in this broad competition is to maintain a level of deterrence, right? That in the mind of policymakers in Zhongnanhai and Beijing, that they say to themselves, today is not the day to roll the iron dice, right? And so to a certain degree, that is the DoD's job. It isn't to solve the entire competition, it isn't to solve everything. Its job is to create in the minds of our opponent that this is just not the right way to go about it, which then frees up sort of others to be able to sort of do things over time, a long-term strategic competition. And so, I think it's also important for us to keep in mind that the DoD doesn't have to do all of this themselves. And I think that was also, Chairman Smith's, part of his message, is that we have to sort of get out of that idea that this is the only tool to fix the problems. It's a useful tool. It does a number of things very well. It does have buying power, and it should be used. But we also should be circumspect about how far it goes, and that it doesn't solve every problem.
I absolutely agree. I guess my point is we need civilian counterparts who can do some of the solving. Like, I don't think DoD can solve the semiconductor problem, but DoD needs to be part of that conversation. It needs to be alignment. Sort of, Mike, what you are doing on a daily basis is at a micro level is that. So just one last question, and that's to Scott, and then we'll move on to the questions from the audience. And that is, there's been some recent studies or things showing that, and I made this point in the piece I just wrote for the DoD PRISM journal, that, on average, technology companies spend about 10% of their revenue on R&D. Semiconductors are maybe 18, 19%. But the big six contractors invest a lot less, some maybe 3, 4%. And that's not because you don't want to innovate. It's because you get paid by the government to do that. And so there is a discussion about expanding the IRAD program, giving you more flexibility to do that. How do we enable defense contractors to be able to focus more on kind of that R&D side as opposed to just later stage production?
So I think I think you hit on part of it, which is IRAD is actually reimbursable by the government. So there's actually an affordability limit set on what the government will actually reimburse, and everything else comes out of profit. So we tend to go to that affordability limit. I will tell you, I will be a little bit of an naysayer. I do think we are way more technologically advanced than China. Again, kind of coming out of the special programs in the black world and really seeing that entire scope of activities. I think technology is not really our limfac. What you have this kind of dual-edged sword, which is special programs limit you in isolated stovepipes, so it can't communicate it with anything else. And what we really need is we need to communicate with everybody else, right? So we need all the tools. So we may develop some really great widget, and I'll go back to the B2 days, but if it doesn't get data or talk to anybody else, it is really a sub-optimized tool. So we really have to find our way through this nexus of where we want to still have things under some level of security, constraint, and control. But really, this back to this now JADC2 discussion of everything connected to everything else. If you can pull data in, you can communicate with everybody, you can leverage everybody's tools into a warfighting environment in milliseconds so you can actually address the problem. I think that's what our fighting advantage is going to be. For us on the IRAD side, that is exactly what we're asking for, which is right now, we're allowed to do IRAD in individual stovepipes of a classified channel, but I can't pull in other things because then it has to actually have all the clearances that go with it. Now, we're working our way through that, and I will tell you that OSD SAPCO has done some just phenomenal job of helping industry get there. But we do have to have environments where you can look, the standard answer when you talk joint all-domain command and control, you can't connect anything you don't know about. You can't utilize anything that you didn't know existed or was planned for in a warfight. We need an ability to pull everything together, and then that actually will tell you where you actually need the next level of IRAD investment. I think in some areas, we are over-invested in some areas and really good, under-invested in others, and we just don't know about each other.
Thank you. Yeah.
Really doing it broad, you can actually start balancing that checkbook a little bit better.
That's something General Wilson has also said. General Wilson, did you want to comment on that?
Because Scott's completely correct on this. As you look at the partnerships that have to happen with industry, and Congressman Smith also talked about the partnerships with our key allies and partners, our trusted partners, to be able to share this data across, from any device to anywhere, to any command center on the globe. We've got to be able to do that seamlessly. And again, a lot of work to be done. I think we're headed in the right direction, but it's a partnership with industry, and it's a partnership with our key allies and partners to do that with them.
Great. So question here from Ben, which is really central question. Do we need to manufacture more electronics in the U.S.? We're good at innovating in electronics, both at the front end and at the business model back end, but less so on the making of them. Thoughts? Okay.
Yes.
I mean, it's simple answer to me.
Simple
I mean,
answer, yes.
If your main geostrategic rival makes large proportions of the global electronics, is the hub of global electronics manufacturing, and your qualitative advantage over your competitor is your mastery of electronics, that's a real problem in the long run. I mean, this becomes extremely difficult for the U.S. to be able to sort of maintain a position of advantage in the long run if that's the case.
So I think everybody's a solid yes. 5 yeses on that. Mike, did you want to?
Well, I think the other flavor that I'm sure Matt will agree with is it's not just limiting to what can we do in the U.S. This is an area where we can be working with allies and partners. So if we need a low-cost manufacturing capability, and China increasingly is not benefiting from labor arbitrage anymore, there are other places that we can go who would be more aligned with our geostrategic interests: Vietnam, India, other places. So I think we clearly need to have more trusted sources. Part of that is U.S., part of it is working with our allies.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. My colleague David Moschella and I, we had a paper out on China and business model competition. We have a new one coming out on India, making that exact same point. Again, though, we need a strategy to help move that along and not just hope and pray. Matt.
But I think that we also have to have a very serious conversation with our allies that hedging between us is very problematic for us, right? So it's hard. So if our strategy about how we will compete and deter is that we'll maintain a qualitative military advantage, over our competitors, and we're going to rely upon our partners to provide some of those key advantages to us, and that we'll sort of spread that out, and we wouldn't all put it in the United States, then we can't exactly have those same partners sort of playing both sides, right? It just doesn't work. And I think we're going to have a sort of an upfront conversation about that, and then it needs to sort of make sense both in a national security and a defense perspective, but also with an economic perspective, right? That there is a sizable market that you're going to be able to sell into, that you're going to be able to have, and so that is the rationale for why you would sort of join with us and avoid some of the it could be more profitable to sell to both sides. It certainly could be, but that sort of undermines the entire rationale for why we would spread this out.
Yeah, General Wilson.
Rob, I completely agree with Matt. And I'll tell you, here's where I'm cautiously optimistic. A few years ago, I would hear some of our partners kind of talking both sides. Hey, don't force me to choose. And now, based on what China's done over the last year to 18 months, they're really seeing they've come around and say, hey, I understand what it would look like if we didn't, and we're now on your side. So I think that conversation has turned in the right direction. So I'm optimistic we're headed in a good place.
Yeah, and I guess earlier, I think maybe Congressman Smith said that. How would we expect, we have for-profit companies in the U.S., and thankfully we do. How could we expect one of them, or a foreign company like from Korea, let's say, to invest here in, say, semiconductor fab, when every other country around the world pretty much will give them a fairly large CapEx subsidy for that first fab? Why would they do anything different than what they're doing now? And I think this idea either that we don't care about fabs, well, then we don't have to worry about anything, right? Because it's fine, the market. But if we care about fabs, that it seems incumbent upon us to fund the CHIPS Act, just to use that as an example. Otherwise,
you can either do that with carrots or sticks. So the carrot is we may be the only country in the world that doesn't provide some subsidies to get chip fabrication capability. So maybe we need to rethink that. But the other is the stick of, if we're in a geostrategic competition, there are some things that we could regulate that would determine that we need U.S. capability for U.S. customers. Other parts of the world do that.
Sure. Although I think perhaps maybe we need to be thinking about both.
Agree.
Yeah. So as a question from, I think this is from my friend and colleague, Mark. Well, it's from Mark Cohen. I think it's Mark Cohen, who is my friend and colleague at UC Berkeley, who's a leading China IP expert, but hopefully. What should the USG do to better develop China tech policy? There have been a range of proposals, a task force, these commissions, additional staffing at agencies. But that does seem to be a critical question. How do we organize government to be able to do a better job here rather than a little bit here, a little bit there, ad hoc, nothing really focused, at least in my opinion? Is it NSC? Is it expanding NSC? Some people say, well, and NEC. Not clear to me NEC is really the right place for this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think I'd start with, so what are the authorities and tools, that are currently available to the executive branch that they can be using and employing now, right? So, I mean, one way to look at is, how do we look at investment screening and investment security? We do that currently under CFIUS. We have new legislation in place under FIRMA, that's now about 2 years old. And we're seeing departments and agencies, right? It sits at Treasury, but it's 16 departments and agencies participating. And we're seeing those sorts of processes being developed. Dual use export controls, right? Sits at Commerce, but multiple departments and agencies play into that. And we're watching a recalibration of how we should do that based upon what we're seeing the PRC be able to do. So I think going through sort of a list of what are the existing authorities and processes we have, and then how do we adapt those things to the reality of what we see the PRC doing today, while balancing our other interests of keeping an open market and running a system as we want to run it. And so that would be my way. And I think it actually does reflect what I think the team that's in the Biden administration is doing now. You could go back and look at the testimony and papers written by a number of the individuals at the NEC and the NSC and in the departments, and they've written on these things already. So I think one could go back and look at the individuals in those positions and see what they've already got on the books, and get a pretty good understanding of I think what their plan is.
Matt, I'd be curious. You and I've talked about this for a couple of years now. Whether there is a scenario where this can be effectively driven because it is a whole of society issue. I think General Wilson mentioned that. I couldn't agree more. If this can be driven without the sponsorship of the White House. I mean, we really need academia. We need businesses involved. We need not only defense contractors, we need all the commercial businesses involved. Everybody needs to think about this competition. What's their role in it? And they need some guidance on what they can do there. And it's hard. We've talked about it's much bigger than DOD. So can that be driven without the White House directly sponsoring it as a national priority?
Well, I think the answer is that it appears that the current administration is driving it from the White House. So, it remains to be seen how successful that will be in all those sorts of things. But, it would seem that we've sort of, answered the question of, do they need to? I think the reality is yes. It's hard to manage a set of policies that cut across multiple departments and agencies that span from sort of economic prosperity through national security, without some sort of senior political and administration leadership on what they're looking for. And to me, it strikes me that is what they've begun to set up. And so we'll likely see that unfold. And I think it appears that you've got congressional leadership, on both sides of the aisle that also see it that way and are ready to help. And we're seeing pieces of legislation come forward that sort of reflect that. Figuring out where the gaps are once they use those authorities and tools, that's going to be the other interesting thing to be able to watch.
So I'd say that makes things successful. We call it the standard three, right? Got to have somebody in charge. We got to have a plan. We got to have timeline and deliverables and hold people accountable to that. Right? And when we do those things, we get results out of that.
So let me put, absolutely on the operational side, but let me push back on the strategic side. We use the example of the biotech, biomedical industry, the drug industry. Increasingly, DoD realizes that we have to have a strong sector here. We can't be dependent on genomics and other kinds of drugs from China. Tell me who in the U.S. government has analyzed the U.S. biopharma sector in a detailed way and what China is doing. Because I don't think there is anybody. I don't mean to be flip about that. We did that at ITIF as part of a grant we received from the Smith Richardson Foundation. We did a deep dive into Chinese biopharma policy, what our strengths and our weaknesses are. And I guess what I'm sort of pressing for is I think there needs to be some capabilities in government to be able to really do that kind of work and not just rely on think tanks.
Yep.
And obviously not just biotech, but a whole slew of things. And then understand where are our weaknesses, where are our strengths. So are we regulating it in the right way? Could we do a better job there? Are there key areas we need to be investing in? What about Chinese venture funding? Mike kind of claim to fame of getting into this space was a great study looking at Chinese VC funding in the Valley. How does that play out? Well, that's, I guess, what I'm suggesting.
I mean, just last week you had the Congressional U.S.-China Commission. They did a panel on bioengineering and biotech. I've certainly seen portions of the Bureau that have looked at some of those challenges and the importance in that area. I think your overall point is absolutely right, that this is likely an area that has not been looked at in detail. But I would offer that they have identified other areas, and going back quite a few years now. I mean, certainly in the semiconductor space, starting in the last 18 months of the Obama administration, a serious focus on the challenges that would come in this space. And we now see sort of actions and activities happening, but that started with a sort of early look. I think the same thing can kind of go into sort of advanced avionics and the stuff that goes into jet aircraft engine production. Another area that there was significant energy put on looking at where our vulnerabilities were, and then putting efforts there. And then lastly, I mean, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence would lay out that we have had sort of a detailed look, and now you have some things coming back. I think absolutely right that bioengineering and biotech is probably next on that list of the things that we need to be worried about. So
let me just, we need to wrap up. I want to be respectful of the time, so we only have like 3 minutes left, but there are a number of questions on here that all relate to this, really at the end of the day, this foundational question, which is STEM skills, and particularly STEM skills that the DoD world can take advantage of. I was talking to somebody recently, a young computer science graduate who had a specialty in natural language processing. I said, you should come to DC. There's a lot of defense firms or the Defense Department. And he's like, nah, I want to do something more interesting. I said, well, it's interesting and important work, but that's a challenge. We've got to figure out a way. Back in the 60s, the best and the brightest wanted to be working on these problems. And I'm not just saying that that's totally not true, but we need to do a better job of that, as well as getting more people in the U.S. pipeline. It's striking to me, for example, if you go to a place like University of Maryland and you look at, or I pick any state school, you look at the amount of CS slots they have that are set aside and available for in-state residents. It's quite low because they make all their money on foreign students. And they do that because they've been given less money from the state and from the feds. So they go where the market is, like everybody else. So, hey, foreign students will pay a bunch of money. We'll train the foreign students. Nothing wrong with that, except a lot of them don't stay, and we can't use them for going to companies like Northrop. So just curious thoughts on that as we close. Scott?
So I'll start. I think when you harken back to the 60s and late 50s, even in the 70s, I think the message with the Soviet Union at the time, with this Iron Curtain and Red Menace, made it much more of a national imperative where people felt a need to come serve in that capacity. They looked at it as an actual world threat. China's got a different message, right? I mean, they're talking about global engagement, and even I just read something today. They're talking about one of their keys is democracy. China's talking democracy, right? I mean, it's fascinating. So it is all about the messaging. So they don't feel that same peril and need that I think they did back in those days. Back to the institutions, we have got to find a way to get more U.S. students into STEM at college levels. And I think we have the ability, I would assume we have the ability at all levels to control that. One of the things we don't do, I will tell you, I think this is less a technology problem in the US than it is a cultural problem from multi-aspect, from academia, from commercial, from DoD and other agencies. But I think it's more cultural. How do we see ourselves changing than it is that we don't have the right things to change?
Great. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I'll jump in real fast. You know what? I used to talk a lot with Chris Lynch when he ran the Defense Digital Service, and he was masterful at getting some of the best graduates from, whether it be Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, to come work for him. And what he did is he empowered them, right? And he made sure they had a security clearance. And he said, you're going to work on wicked hard problems. And they may only be there a couple of years, but you know what? It's a couple great years helping serve our government. And so I think there's certainly an outreach. We have to do that. We have to get the broad message out is, hey, we're all in this together. And the government is not a bad thing. We got some really smart, hard problems, right? We need your help, right? But we're not gonna put you over here and just do nothing. We're gonna let you do things that you would never be able to do anywhere. But we got to make that real. And Chris was pretty successful at it.
And presumably they go back to wherever they're going and say, hey, I had good experience. Maybe you ought to do this as well.
Absolutely.
If we find a way to work better with all of the companies that are in the private sector, even their service there is aiding the national security mission of making sure we're at the forefront of technology, and then we can use that in the government.
Yeah.
Great. Well, with that, as I said, I could keep talking about this for days, as Mike knows, but we do need to wrap up. First of all, I want to thank all four of you. It was really a fascinating discussion. I would also mention, for those of you who are interested, that we have an event tomorrow on how to deepen transatlantic cooperation on AI for defense that my colleague Hothan Omar is leading. That's going to be from, anyway, it's on our website. It's from, 12 to, it should be 10 to 11, I think. But anyway, I encourage you to follow that if you're interested in AI and defense. And I want to thank everybody on the panel, as well as thank all the listeners, and look forward to seeing you again at another future ITIF panel. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Rob.